All right. We're going to talk today about how Rome becomes Christianized and how this changes. Really, this course is talking about the earliest part of medieval history. So the first part of the course, first part of your textbook and so forth, is we're talking about the transition from the Roman Empire and the problems that Rome faces at the end, what we might call the end of their empire period, and also the rise of Christianity during this period. So one of the things that we need to at least briefly talk about is that, the Roman Empire period starts with Augustus. It starts in the late BCs and goes into, certainly by you're into the 1st century AD, the late part of the 1st century BC is when the empire begins. And the part, most of it is in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Okay? So, the Roman era that's known as Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. The Roman peace. It begins with Augustus in 31 BC, and most people would say it ends in 180 AD with the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. That's really where you begin to see things changing when you get to the end of the 2nd century. And by the time you get into the 3rd century, certainly it's clear things are changing. Rome is beginning to have a lot of trouble on their borders. They have expanded and expanded. Augustus had advised the Romans to not expand any more than he had. Now, of course, they didn't follow that. Most every emperor, not everyone, but most of them, wanted to add some territory so that they could basically claim they were a conqueror, and so they could say everything is expanding and so forth. And so they did. And so Rome, the Roman Empire expanded, all the way up into the island of England, up to Scotland, all the way down in North Africa, all the way over into the eastern parts of Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and so forth. So they have a very large period. The problem is the birth rate. There's a lot of reasons why did Rome fall. We're not probably going to be able to answer that completely here today, but there are a lot of problems that Rome faced. One is a declining birth rate. The Romans stopped having as many children as they used to. So this means that most of their population came from immigrants. Any of this sound familiar? Well, it should. So this began to change things. Now, one of the things they held back was Roman citizenship, because Roman citizenship was a prize. But then eventually they began offering Roman citizenship rather routinely to a lot of people. So I think there are some parallels, say, to the United States today in some ways. The United States has been around quite a while, sort of resting on our reputation, if you will, our past. But things are changing, and things were changing for the Romans. And they didn't always adapt that well to it. And so we see these kinds of problems coming about. So here you see then, eventually, the extent of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. All the area that's there in whatever that color is, sort of the orangey tan. I'm sure there's another name for it. Maybe it's burnt citrus. How's that? See, to me, that's not really a color, but people call it those. Ooh, peach. Georgia peach. Yes. Well, anyway, you see it there. You can see all the way up to England. You see all the way down to what would be Jordan, Egypt. North Africa would be Libya, Tunisia. All the way out past Turkey into Syria And at different times they held parts of Iraq as well. Not shown on this map. Now the other thing is you see the cities of Rome here. Urban areas and major cities. Again, we're not going to go through all of that, but notice how scattered it is. How scattered it is. You know, many people, somebody wrote a book, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that wrote the book, it's called The Roman City or something like that, and basically argued that the history of Rome was really the history of cities. History of the city of Rome itself, but then that pattern duplicated in other cities around the empire. But we start to see some large cities there. Notice you've got Antioch, Ephesus, Trier, Carthage, and so forth. Alexandria. These were major cities of the Roman Empire. Now, the Peace of Rome, the reason for the Peace of Rome is, of course, they had a huge military. The Romans needed a huge military. They built a network of roads that connected their empire. The roads that ran, they say all roads lead to Rome. Maybe you've heard that saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, that was on purpose. The Romans wanted a network of very nicely made roads that would be able, so they could move their troops and equipment of war pretty rapidly around the empire. They really needed to be able to do that so that they could go to any place where trouble began. The estimates of the army, of course, fluctuate in this period, but it's over 300,000 to about 500,000 soldiers. And most of these soldiers are out along the borders. Rome has huge long borders that need to be protected. A lot of it does not have real strong natural barriers. They do set up behind rivers, like up in Europe. The Rhine River and the Danube become pretty much their barriers there. In England, they actually built a wall. You've probably heard of it. Hadrian's Wall. And then north of that, Antonius Pius built the Antonine Wall, even further north. Last summer, not summer of 2018, 2017, I've spent a lot of time on Hadrian's Wall. That's one of my favorite places to go visit when I'm in England. But the summer of 2017, I actually went and tried to trace the route of the Antonine Wall, which is not as well preserved, through Scotland. That was interesting. That was interesting, and found quite a bit of it. Okay, there's still parts of it that are left. Well, Rome had to set up these barriers, physical walls in the place of the island there of England. They had the desert to the south in Africa, which functioned that way. Desert over in Jordan. But, some of the places in the east were not as easily defended. And the places to the north in Europe, they would set up behind the Danube and the Rhine River. But they had an extensive system of roads that connect all the areas, all the provinces. And, of course, they had Roman ships. The name of that sea is called the Mediterranean. Do you know what the word Mediterranean really means? Land is a part of it. Terrain, right? It really means in the middle of our land. The sea in the middle of our land. Well, that's a rough translation. In other words, it's our sea. The Romans felt the Mediterranean was theirs. And they controlled all the shoreline. And so they sailed around without without fear, really. There were different times when there were pirates, Johnny Depp and those guys sailing around. But, that was their sea. So they had cargo ships, they had warships, they could move people and goods and things around through the middle of their empire with this giant sea. Okay? All right. So the Peace of Rome then, the Pax Romana, is this period of time of roughly 200 years. Let's just say roughly 200 years. That Rome is at relative peace. They're still fighting different people, but they're mainly putting down some rebellions. They are conquering some land and taking it over, but they don't have any major aggressors coming at them. They're ruling their world, and they are the powerhouse. They are the only superpower of their day in that part of the world. It's Rome. Okay, so they rule the Mediterranean. They rule most of Europe. So at its peak then, we see that the Roman Empire is very large, or as someone would say, huge. It's about 3,000 miles from east to west. East to west. So it's as wide as the United States is. Maybe even a bit wider, but at least that wide. It does share a boundary in the east with the Parthians, of which they had clashed at different times, but they had established a kind of treaty with the Parthians in the east. And they kept expanding, but mostly the only thing that stopped them from expanding was geography. It was not people. Okay? They didn't go any further south in Africa because it's Sahara Desert. That's a good boundary, right? They didn't go any further north because you hit the North Sea, and you hit the Atlantic. You hit big deserts down around Jordan, Arabia. There's big deserts there. So where they hit deserts and where they hit oceans, that's where they stopped. And they did go on across to England, and they finally stopped. That's the thing I've always found interesting. They didn't just take over the whole island. They set up those walls. Mainly because of the Picts, I suppose. Part of it, I suppose, it depends on who you talk to. Some people will say the Romans looked at it and said, it's really not worth it. Because, it was pretty swampy. It's hilly. It's very rugged. It's very swampy. It's not good farmland. It's way up there. It's cold. They didn't really like it up there. But plus they got a lot of resistance. So, of course, it's Scottish pride that the Romans never took over Scotland, their independence streak. On the other hand, some say, well, the Romans just looked at it and said, you know what? No, it's not worth it. Well, I don't know. Whichever way you want to look at it, all right? But they did set up a major boundary there. Population, again, an estimate, but it's estimated around 50 million. So roughly 500,000 of those are soldiers. So you get an idea of the sort of percentage. 3% of the population were these urban elites, and that controlled at least a third of all the wealth. A third of all the wealth was in the hands of 3% of the people. One thing you'd find about Roman society is that it's very stratified. Very stratified. Much more so than what Americans would like to think America is stratified. In other words, we say anybody could become president and all that kind of thing, and we can overcome things. We're not locked in. But for the Romans, they were. Your birth, your wealth, these things, there's a real dichotomy between us and them. This is why Christianity was seen as threatening. Part of the reason it was seen as threatening is that Christianity did not hold to these social barriers. Other Roman religions were kind of specific. Some of them just for men, some of them just for women, some of them for certain groups. They had different trade groups and things, where people could sort of join. These groups had sort of identities. But Christianity was just, anybody. Anybody could join. That made the Romans nervous. They didn't like that. Slaves could join? Really? Slaves? Why? They got very suspicious of that because, slave rebellions and other things. Well, but really a lot of the people of Rome were farmers. You got to remember that. In all pre-modern society, usually about 90% of the population is dealing somehow with something revolving around food production, animal production, and farming. So a lot of them were farmers. And remember that all around the Mediterranean, and this includes Palestine as well, they sometimes call it the Mediterranean Triad, but the three main things that people ate and raised, it was very staples of their diet, was grain, primarily wheat, maybe in some cases barley, but mostly wheat. Wheat with a E-A-T. And grapes and olives. Those were the main things that they raised and ate, consumed. And of course, grapes could be made into wine. Olives could be eaten, although, it's a lot of work to be able to eat an olive. We don't think much about it today. You go down and buy a jar of olives, for $2, $3. But there's a lot of work goes into it to getting an olive so you can actually eat it. Most of the olives were pressed. They would take the olives and they would put them in an olive press and they would press it down and squeeze the oil out of it. Okay, so most of the olives were consumed as olive oil for cooking. Olive oil was also used for cleaning your body. You'd coat it with olive oil and kind of scrape it off, kind of like moisturizing your skin. And olive oil was used for lamps, to light lamps as well, oil lamps. Well, Pax Romana, while things were peaceful and a lot of good building campaigns, a lot of temples, Augustus claimed that when he came to Rome, it was made of bricks, and when he left Rome, it was made of marble. He had transformed it. But there were problems. It wasn't, it's the peace of Rome, but it doesn't mean everything was. Well, here's a phrase: hunky-dory. You ever hear that? Hunky-dory. You guys probably never heard that term before, right? No, that's an old term. Have you heard it? You've heard it. Okay, a couple of you heard it. Well, I don't know. It's an old phrase. Basically, not everything was great for everybody. For example, there was a lot of slavery in Rome. A lot of people most estimates are at least a third of the population were slaves. Now, here's the thing you need to remember about Roman slavery. Roman slavery we should not identify it with, let's say what I think most people identify with 19th century, 18th, 19th century slavery in the United States or Europe, which was race-based. Primarily one race were slaves. For the Romans, they were equal opportunity enslavers. Anybody who they conquered was enslaved. So it was certainly not a racial, skin color or anything like that. It was, we conquered the Thracians, so now those Thracians that we conquered, we're going to bring a big chunk of them back. They're going to be slaves, etc. Okay, so, and the slaves did not do as much, we think of slaves working plantations, right, doing a lot of agricultural work. Slaves in the Roman world didn't do as much of that agricultural work. They were mostly household slaves, maybe administrative slaves. They were given different jobs. For example, there's a lot of stuff needs to be done around your house that maybe you would rather not do. Like take out the garbage and clean things, wash clothes and cook and all those kinds of things which take a lot of time. That's where the Romans would have slaves. They would have household slaves that would watch their children, that would do the laundry, that would gather in the water, go out and get the food, prepare the food, clean everything. That's a big chunk of Roman slaves would be working in Roman households of the wealthy. So there was a lot of slavery. There were attacks on the borders, especially in the north. Germanic people were attacking. They would sometimes attack. The Picts occasionally would attack up in England and so forth. So there were what we might call skirmishes. There were attacks on the borders of Rome. Within the cities of the empire, there was often violence as well and conflict. Sometimes gangs of men robbing people, that sort of thing. So yeah, there was law and order problems within the cities. There was also disease that would come at different times. So, these were all problems, but Rome, really the Roman Empire survived and spread by these cities. The smaller cities basically imitated Roman culture and what was going on in the city of Rome. In fact, just like we see later on in European imperialism, a lot of times these cities are being more Roman than the Romans. Just like some of the British cities are more British than the British, right? Some cities in India. In other words, they're following all the protocol. Like say in India, it's tea time, so we got to have tea time exactly at the right time. We got to wear the right kind of clothes. We're going to play cricket and all these other kinds of things. We're going to emulate these things almost, in a fanatical way, maybe even more than people do back in England. Same with the Romans. The Roman culture was imitated or emulated in these Roman cities, and that's really what spread it all around the empire. All right, let's move on. Now, that's painting the picture, a pretty good picture for Rome for about 200 years. Up to around 180 AD, late 2nd century, certainly by the time you get into the 3rd century, which are the 200s, and then into the 4th century, the 300s, things are beginning to fall apart in Rome. More and more, even Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, who by the way was a philosopher emperor, ended up spending much of his reign in the north and Germanic territories, fighting German, maintaining the borders. The Romans start to find themselves just trying to maintain their borders was becoming overwhelming. They're being attacked more and more. And Marcus Aurelius, for example, thought, why has this changed? His idea that he thought that it changed is that Christianity had begun to grow. Why would that cause the Germans to attack? Well, his idea was the Roman gods are not happy with Rome because these Christians don't go to the Roman temples. They don't venerate the Roman gods. And so the Roman gods are basically punishing Rome for not being as devout as they should be. Okay? That was Marcus Aurelius' idea. And in fact, Marcus Aurelius began some persecution of Christians for that very reason. So that was a kind of common thread that some of those who persecuted Christianity had. The problems that Rome was facing they tried to link to the rise of Christianity. In fact, if you read Edward Gibbon's, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, he's a British guy. He's writing, in like 1890s or whatever. He is blaming the fall of Rome on the rise of Christianity. So that idea persists for a long time. Well, invading tribes begin to break through the borders. The empire was depending more and more on the military, and guess what? Their economy is beginning to decrease. So their expenses are going up and their income is going down. Just to put it in sort of blunt economic terms, they have to spend more to protect the borders, and their economy is not doing as well. That's a kind of downward cycle. So what are they going to have to do? Well, I always tell people this, sometimes they're surprised. Governments don't have any money. They only get money from one source. You, me. Taxes. That's how they get their money. So, I hear people say, well, the government's going to pay for this and the government's going to pay for that. Don't worry, the government will pay for this. I think the government only gets money one way. That's through taxes. And so if the spending goes up, the taxes are going to go up. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. Really. There's not some magical source of this stuff. It's going to have to come. And that's what happened. The Romans have to start taxing the people more just when the economy's not doing as well. Now they start asking for more. Why? Because we're being attacked on the borders. We've got to have more military. The military had always been often paid or compensated, often by what was conquered. You see, this is what highly motivated a lot of these guys. If we go out and beat these people, whoever they are, let's say the Thracians, we defeat the Thracians, then what happens? We get the good land. We get the pick of what the Thracians have, and the Thracians lose and we win. And the soldiers would actually get, when they would retire, veterans of that war would get farms. They would get estates. They would get pieces of land from the areas that had been conquered. So that was highly motivating to them. That's not happening anymore. The Romans aren't conquering any new land. In fact, the Romans are losing land, and they need more and more. So the costs are going up, the morale is going down in the military, and it's this military that really ends up, especially now from 180 to 395, it's the military that begins to make and break emperors. Because what you're going to start to see is a very quick turnover of emperors. And very few of them die by natural causes. They're being assassinated. Take a look at that last thing. Between 235 and 285, that's 50 years. There were 20 emperors in a 50-year period. That means you're only being emperor for about less than 3 years. 2.5 years is the average reign of an emperor, and only one of them survived. All the rest of them were killed while in office. Now, the empire is sort of falling apart. It's in great decline. It's going to be Diocletian in the late 3rd century who is going to reorganize the Roman Empire, and he's going to help save it, if you will, from, the Roman Empire could have disintegrated a lot sooner. But Diocletian does a reorganization. He divides the empire into 4 parts. It's known as a tetrarchy. He sets up a sort of what is called an Augustus and a Caesar of each east and west. And of course, he's the main guy, but he has these sort of assistants, right, who are helping him run the empire and keeping an eye on it. And so that's what reorganizes it and sort of stops some of the losses of territory and fixes a lot of things. Well, Eventually, that's going to lead to the rise of an emperor named Constantine. In 306. And I won't go into the details of his rise. We'll probably get some of that in our presentations that we'll get next week. But basically, during this period from, let's say, 284 to 337, things kind of turn around. Some of the disintegration stops and begin to put things back together, reorganize the imperial government. But Constantine, of course, is going to bring a major change, right? He is going to convert to Christianity. And he will be then the first Christian emperor of Rome. Now, in fact, he's not baptized till he's near death. Some people have seen that as an indication that he was not legitimately converted, or he was just somehow using it politically. I think it's better understood that at the time, many people believed that baptism took care of, washed away, whatever, removed past sins, but not future sins. So many people began putting off their baptism until they thought they were getting close to death, so they could sort of get rid of the most sin at once. Anyway, that's one reason why. I do think he was serious. I don't really see any political advantage for Constantine to convert to Christianity. Christianity was a persecuted minority, and they were really not powerful. Mostly they were slaves. A lot of them were poor. So I don't see much political advantage for him to convert. Now, once he does convert, and it's clear that he is on the side of Christianity, well, conversions go through the roof. We have mass conversions to Christianity. The church mushrooms, the numbers of Christians really explodes. That creates some problems of its own. So as we said, Diocletian divided the empire east and west, which roughly goes through the Balkans, and sort of established two power centers, two main cities. One of them being Byzantium, which will later be named Constantinople, in the east, and of course Rome in the west. Now, Rome is actually in this late period going to become more vulnerable than Constantinople because it's on the peninsula there, it's not well defended, and the invasions are coming that way. Constantinople, on the other hand, was much more defendable. It had walls all the way around it. It was on a peninsula. It had water access right out, so it could bring in supplies, bring in people and goods. So it was far more defendable in the east and a little bit out of the line of fire. So we see then that by the late 4th century, if not before, the division east and west is permanent. You have the Eastern Roman Empire, you have the Western Roman Empire, the remnant of it. And in the east, people begin to start to use the name, at least historians have used the name, the Eastern Roman Empire. They also call it the Byzantine Empire. So you've heard of the Byzantines, then you've heard of the Eastern Roman Empire. So in fact, if you consider that the Roman Empire is going to last, Roman until 1453. It starts in 35 BC and goes to 14. It goes 1,500 years, the Roman Empire, and Roman civilization even longer. But what the major change there, starting around 320, 330 with Constantine, is you now have a Christianized Roman society Constantine does not make Christianity the official religion of Rome. I sometimes hear people say that. He really did not. He made it a legal religion. The Romans divided all religion into two parts. You had a legal religion and an illegal religion. Christianity was illegal. Now, up to about, let's say, 64 BC, somewhere in the 60s, Nero, Christianity had been seen as a part of Judaism, another group of Judaism, by the Romans. The Romans said, okay, you got Sadducees, you got Pharisees, you got Essenes, you got Zealots, you got Christians. It's just another group. Now, as long as it was viewed as another group of the Jews are always fighting with each other over which one was right, even it could turn violent and so forth. The Romans just wanted to stay out of that. Because the Romans had a special deal with the Jews, which had been set up by Herod the Great, that they were exempt from going to the temple and doing a lot of things that other groups had to do. As long as Christianity was under that umbrella, then it was a legal religion because it's part of Judaism. And the Jews were working hard to do this, once it's determined that Christianity is not Judaism, it's not the same thing, which happened somewhere around 60 BC, or 60 AD, maybe 62, anyway, somewhere in there, then Christianity becomes an illegal religion, religio illicita, and then it becomes persecuted by the Romans, starting in the 60s, right on up until the time of Constantine in the 320, 323. He makes all religions, not just Christianity, he makes all religions in Rome legal. He removes that barrier, legal and illegal. Looks like we're out of time. I think we are, aren't we?